All right, so Margie, is today about disclosures and reviewing the contracts, right?
Okay. I believe so. Going over what Marcus looks for in the disclosures.
Okay.
So I'm guessing it's going to be signatures, initials, making sure everything's completed, stuff like that.
Okay, great. We can get started. You can go ahead and share your screen,
Okay.
please.
Can you see it?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So we'll just go one by one on the disclosures and what to look for throughout the transaction. So here we have the agency relationship, and this is the selling firm to the buyer. So we want to make sure that the buyer signatures are here. If it's one buyer, it'll just be one box checked. If it's two, then both will be here. And then the buyer's agent here.
Mm-hmm.
And once it gets ratified, the seller will sign down here. So those are signatures that we will need to watch out for. If there's another seller, if there's two sellers, then this also would be signed as well.
Okay. Are these documents pulled from SkySlope?
These documents are pulled from WIN forms
Oh, okay.
or car forms. That's where you would pick, or zip forms. I'm sorry. There's so many names for it. It's changed throughout the years, but
Yeah.
so zip forms plus, I guess you would be the correct one to go to. These are where you would pull all the disclosures from.
Okay.
Here we have the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. If it's a pending that we are sending over, then we would need the buyer to sign and date, and Marcus or whoever the agent is, the buyer's agent, to sign and date. And we also want to make sure that the BRE numbers are there. Then once it comes back, the seller will sign here. Exit. They'll sign here, and the listing agent will sign here. I don't know why it's not. There we go. We also need to make sure that this is completed, the date is completed. We want to make sure that all dates and BRE numbers are completed
Mm-hmm.
on each form. Next, we have the wire fraud advisory. Of course, the buyer and the seller, these are things you need to look out for, the signature and the date. And then this is a copy of the purchase agreement. We want to make sure we have the date prepared. And then, of course, the agent usually will fill all this in, but we want to make sure that this is completed correctly. So these little boxes here need to be checked off. We want to see what kind of loan it is. If it's all cash, there's normally not any contingencies. So something like this, we need to watch out for, the dates on the next page, or the page 3. And then just to let you know, this is where we pull our dates from, unless there's a counteroffer. So you can always verify with these dates. But anyways, we want to make sure that the buyer and the seller are initialing the bottom of these pages.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to keep going. Oh, sorry, the form I'm using is a little bit laggy. It kind of jumps on me.
Yeah. It's a big document.
So again, we just want to make sure we have all the signatures here before we set up a file in SkySlope. So as far as I know, she will be reviewing. So these are things that she'll need to look out for. These are not always initialed. It's really, usually it's the buyer initials and the seller will initial. But if you see it's not there, then I wouldn't worry about it. But if you see one that is initialed and the other isn't, then I would try to track down initials on that one. So here's more. As you can see, there's 3 portions on this page that need to be initialed. We want to make sure that the buyer signed and dated here. And then the seller is going to initial down here. And then the seller will sign here. And the buyer will initial down here. A lot of buyers do miss these, so it's very important that this last page is initialed, that we look for that. Not only on top of the seller and the buyer signatures, we want to make sure that each party has completed their portion of this part here. That includes BRE numbers, dates. The address I don't worry too much about, because as long as the BRE numbers are there, we're able to pull where they're at, what company they're from. But we still want to make sure at least the company is there, the agent's name, the agent's signature, which would go here, the broker's BRE ID number, the agent's BRE ID number, and the date. And again, that will go here as well. So whoever the other agent is, or if it's the same agent, we want to make sure it's still completed.
Does it matter
Next,
we use caps or lowercase? Is there a preference?
No, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
And we as a TC can fill it in if we have the information. We can fill this part in on behalf of the other agent. But I usually like to have the other agent complete it. And then if I don't get a response, then I go ahead and complete it myself if I have the information made available.
Okay. And blue or black text is okay?
Yeah, it doesn't matter. This is the buyer inspection advisory. Of course, we want to make sure either the one or both buyers can sign here. Sometimes if there's a third buyer or four buyers, it'll be split here, and all 4 buyers would sign. Some agents prepare an additional form to make place for the other 2 buyers. But it's just we want to make sure that we have their signatures there. This is a disclosure report example, and the one thing that Marcus wants is to make sure that basically the TC is putting the following verbiage here. And I'm just going to make up a number because I don't know how many actual pages are here. Dated, and then you put the date. So every time I DocuSign any kind of report, it could be the NHG report, the pest report, home inspection report, sewer, any kind of report, I always make sure that I have the buyer has read and received all X amount of pages, in this case 40, of the NHG report. So here you want to make sure you put if it's a pest report, if it's a home report, and then you want to put down who it's provided by. And again, in this case, it's disclosure sourced, and it's dated 12/13. We always want to make sure that that this is on the cover page. Not only on the cover page does it need to have a signature, so we also need a signature here. I will highlight it just so she needs a copy just for her records. So I can PDF this over to her. So we want to make sure that is completed on the first and the last page of the inspection. So as I scroll down here, and I'll get to the last page, as I scroll down here, he also wants us to have the buyer acknowledge the property tax information as well as mold. So this is all it's almost always in the disclosure report. But if it's not, then I just go to the advisory, which we'll get to later, and I'll show you where all those are at too to have the buyer initial.
Okay.
So in this case, let's see, we have property tax, all this tax information. I usually just have the buyer initial it all of this. So page 10, and then the mold notice is page 22. So I'm going to go, if it lets me. So I usually have the buyer initial here. And every NHD report is different. It's not always going to be the same. I should have grabbed the property ID. So they're just going to initial all the tax. Now we're going to go to that page 22 where it has the mold. Sorry.
No
I
worries.
said page 22. Where is it? Oh, there we go. And here it says toxic mold. So I always have the buyer initial anywhere along here. It could be down here as long as it's just in this portion.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really just preference. Okay. And then we go back down. We get to the last page. Too far. Okay, here's the last page of this NHD report. As you can see, there's not a lot of room here to type it out, so I normally put it somewhere up here. And again, it's going to be buyer has read and received all X pages of the NHD provided by, disclosure source dated. So this is another thing that she is going to look for here, and it should have the buyer signatures as well here. So again, I'm sorry, 1 second. Hey, be quiet, please, or go to your room. Okay. So again, the cover page and the very last page of all reports need to be signed, and it needs to have this exact verbiage. Mm-hmm. Most companies will just throw a signature tag on there, but Marcus wants to make sure that the buyer is basically taking full responsibility. He's read everything. Anything that goes in the litigation or court, we want to make sure that our end is completed. Everything's, covered. So that's why we do that. Mm-hmm. Okay, this is just a basic continuously removable. When it comes in, we want to make sure that one of these boxes are checked here. We want to make sure it's usually this one. We want to make sure it's numbered. We want to make sure that we have the date there, that it was accepted, the address, obviously. And I always make sure that the buyer's and seller's name is typed out as well. I make sure that whatever box they check is there. We don't want to send a blank one for buyer signature. So I always make sure whatever box is there is checked. And then we make sure the buyer signs it. Now, the seller, when it comes back, there's two ways it can be completed. It's either going to be seller signed here, or it's going to have the the listing agent initials here with the box, seller to authorize agent on the date. So it's going to have this one or this one. Sometimes there's both. It's still good as long as someone signs for it.
Okay. So
this is just a basic and addendum. Again, we want to make sure that it's numbered. We want to make sure that it's, what is it to? Is it to a purchase agreement? Is it to a lease? Is it to the TDS? and I'm not sure how familiar she is with disclosures, but if it is to say a TDS and we already have an addendum 1 to a purchase agreement, we don't want to put, addendum 2 to the TDS. That it's not, it would kind of, we want to keep it the same. So I'm trying to explain this the best way I can. If we have an addendum, okay, let me start over. This is an addendum to a purchase agreement. So we have the number here, purchase agreement, again, the date here, address, buyer, seller, what the verbiage is we want to look at, and then we want to make sure that stop doing that. Okay. Buyer and seller signatures are here. Again, we want to pay close attention to these numbers. If it's an addendum to the purchase agreement, another addendum, then it would be 2. If it's another one to the purchase agreement, it would be 3. Now, if someone throws an addendum 4 and they have this box checked, that's incorrect. It needs to be addendum 1 to the real estate transfer disclosure.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, if there's any questions on that, she can call me. Yeah, it very rarely happens, but we just want to make sure that they're not numbering these all weird and funky.
Yeah, and if it's addendum to a certain document, then it needs to be number 1 or 2 according to the actual. We have to count them separately. Okay.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the AVID. This is basically the agent's visual inspection disclosure. We want to make sure that at least, this is completed, and then the broker's name. We want to make sure whoever we represent, that those initials are there. So both the buyer and the seller should be initialing these portions. And she'll be reviewing the executed versions of it. So those are things that she'll need to look out for. I want to make sure that this is completed. Buyer, seller initials. And then here, this whole section, we want signatures there. Now we have the buyer inspection waiver. If the buyer is not choosing to obtain a home or pest inspection, then we will need them to initial here and then sign here. And then if you see here, I usually have them initial everything because it does kind of, so the buyer will initial here and here. So if they decide, not to get any inspections, this is what they would complete. If they decide just not to get a home inspection or a pest inspection, then they just need to initial here. Sign here. This is the buyer's final walkthrough. Normally, in most cases, this is always left blank by the buyer. So if it's blank, we should probably get them to check this box here that they're waiving their inspection. But sometimes they're not waiving it, they're completing it, but they choose not to put any comments there, and that's okay. So if you just want to make sure that there's buyer and seller signature here. The seller technically is not required to sign this document if it is blank. So then we would just need buyer signature, especially if we represent the buyer's agent. This is the buyer inspection elections. I prefer this form over the buyer inspection waiver just because it kind of breaks down each and every report. The buyer, if you notice here, it says buyer represents and agrees that buyer has independently considered the available inspections and at this time has decided to order only those inspections selected yes below. And that this lists everything. I prefer to use this form. If the buyer, when we use this form, we want to make sure that all yes and no boxes are checked. So if they click yes here, and this is the only item they're getting, then all of these would need to be clicked no. So we want to make sure that's completely checked off and filled out. And then we have buyer signatures there. Okay, this is a lead-based paint disclosure, and it's only required on homes that are built prior to 1978. So anything that's built in 2000, we don't need this form. We want to make sure that there's a box checked off. What is it referring to? Is it referring to the purchase agreement or seller disclosures? So those, if that's where you would click other. So we want to make sure that one of these boxes are checked, that the date is there, and then again, the buyer and seller name. Now, most cases, these disclosures, if it's a listing, are prepared at the time of a listing. So we're not going to have buyer information yet, but we will at least have seller information. We also won't have the residential purchase agreement checked off here because it wouldn't be in contract yet. But we should check off here and what it is too. We could put listing agreement and put the listing date here, or we could put seller disclosures and then put the date that we prepared the seller disclosures here. So it really just depends if it's a listing or if it's a buyer side. We want to make sure that one of those boxes are checked off.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
This is not a requirement to have this filled out. Most sellers do not fill it out. So we just look for seller signatures, buyer to initial. And again, here's some more things that need to be signed. And that's fully base paint. Next, we have the market conditions advisory. Again, the buyer and seller are to initial. And then on page 2, sorry, my computer is jumping. Page 2, the buyer and the seller to sign and date. We already went over this form, so I'm not going to go over that. This is the agency listing firm to seller. The first form that we went over was buyer's agent to the buyer. I'm sorry, just a moment.
Sure.
Okay. If we have a listing side, go to your room. Hold on a second. I'm on the phone. Okay, play a different game. I'm on the phone, please. Hello?
Hello.
Okay, sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
Did you hear that?
No, I think it was.
I tried to mute. Okay.
No worries.
All right, so if the first one that I showed you was selling agent to the buyers, this one is a listing firm to the seller. It's always required when we represent the listing agent.
Mm-hmm.
So in this case, we want to make sure that the seller, these boxes are checked, the seller has signed, and then our agent has signed as well. Now, if we represent the buyer's agent, we do not need this form from the listing agent. It's just something it's an agreement between the listing agent and the seller. And the same with the selling firm, the selling agent to the buyer, that needs to be signed by the seller.
Okay.
I already went over this form. All right, this is the statewide buyer and seller advisory. I do always make sure that these are dated, by the way. I don't leave them ever undated. So it's not a requirement so long as we have the seller dating where they're supposed to be dating after their signature.
Mm-hmm.
But I still like to make sure that this is there. So in the statewide advisory, I have the buyer initial here because it kind of goes over the mold and all the other environmental hazards that there are. I also make sure that they initial here next to this item. So you can just, tag it there,
as long as they're acknowledging that they read this. There's another mold. I have them do this one too. So I just cover all ends because I know how thorough Marcus is. So I just make sure it's all in there.
Yeah.
And then I believe it's page 11. 11? Yep, page 11, right here, the electronic signature. We want to make sure that they also initial there because we do a lot of electronic signatures. So we just want to make sure that the buyer acknowledges that portion. And then here's the full signature tag. We definitely want to make sure the buyer has signatures and date. The seller has signatures and date. The information provided by the selling firm and the listing firm need to have both BRE numbers, and there should be a date as well as a signature. Again, this is one of those items where the address doesn't really matter. If it's there, it's there. If it's not a big deal. So just these portions here would be the most important to be completed.
I think the screen might be frozen just now. Oop. I'm still seeing the environmental hazard section. Are you already past that?
Yes.
Can you stop screen share and then start it again? See if we can get it going again. Yeah, it was definitely stuck.
Is that better?
It says that you started sharing, but I'm not seeing the screen. Let me see. Participant. Can you stop and start again?
Sure.
Okay, the screen is just black for some reason. Let's end this meeting and I'll send you a new link right away and see if that'll somehow this must have timed out or something because I'm not seeing your screen at all.
Okay.
Okay, I'll
So what do I need? Stop
email
share
you.
and then get a new link?
Yeah, I'll email you a new link. Okay, thanks. Bye-bye. Stop that video. Okay, looks like we're waiting for your microphone to come online. All right, let's see if we
Are
can.
you ready?
Yeah, let's see if we can share. Okay, awesome. We're back in business. I can see the page 11.
Okay.
Okay, yep.
I'll just start from there.
Okay.
Let me know when you're ready.
All right, go ahead, please. Okay, I'm ready.
Okay. So here's the electronic signatures. This is where we also need the buyer to initial. And then down here, the buyer is to sign and date, seller is to sign and date, buyer's agent is to sign and date, listing agent to sign and date, and we also want to make sure that these BRE numbers are completed. And moving on to the seller property questionnaire, we want to make sure that these items are completed here. Not so much the parcel number, but at least the county, the address, and the city. We want to make sure that all of these right here have a yes or no box checked off. If any boxes are yes, then we need to make sure that there is an explanation here. Buyer and seller to initial. Buyer and seller to initial. And I will mention too, if all of these boxes are no, then it's fine. There doesn't need to be an explanation.
Okay.
Buyer and seller to initial. And seller and buyer to sign. Now moving to the real estate transfer disclosure, we do want to make sure that these items are completed here. The city, the county, the address, and then also the date. So usually this is the date that the seller is going to complete the property or complete the disclosure, or the date that we are preparing the disclosure. It just needs to be dated there. And these are the most common boxes missed, which is the seller occupying the home and the operating condition of it. And so these are definitely something we will also want to make sure is checked off. This should be completed as well. It should not be blank. Buyer and seller to initial. Again, this should be completed. All the yes and no boxes should be completed. If there is one blank, then we need to send it back and obtain the box. The box would be completed. Now, if the buyer signed it and we didn't catch it, then we need to get an addendum to the TDS and for them to mention whatever box was missing. They need to put that on the addendum, and then we need to send it for buyer and seller signatures. But if all is okay, then we just need buyer and seller to initial. And then here we have the seller to sign and date. We also have seller down here to sign and date. So if someone else, if we represent the buyer's agent, these items should be completed from the listing agent. I wouldn't worry too much about this one because normally the seller won't sign until a buyer agent avid is provided. So if it's not there, I would, in the beginning of the transaction, not to worry about it. But we definitely want to make sure that all these signature tags are completed by the end of the transaction. So here, I always make sure that the listing agent or the buyer agent check these boxes. If they click this box, agent notes the following items, then they need to put an explanation here. It can't just be blank. So we also want to make sure that the listing agent signs and dates, the buyer agent signs and dates, the buyer signs and dates. And then again, you'll see here, buyer and listing agent to date as well. So this whole form needs to be completed thoroughly, and that includes these little check boxes. I believe we already went over the wire fraud advisory, but we'll go ahead and highlight it again. We want to make sure all this is signed and dated. This is the water conserving plumbing fixtures and carbon monoxide detector. I want to make sure the buyer and the seller initial here and that they sign here. This is the water heater and smoke detector. This form is not required if there is a TDS or real estate transfer disclosure provided. It's not required to have this form, but sometimes if there's a trust or if it's an REO or a probate, then we will need this form, and that's why I did include it.
Okay.
So you'll see here there's two portions that need to be signed. Those need to be completed by the buyer and the seller. This is the residential earthquake hazard report. It is only required on homes that are built prior to 1960.
Okay.
So if we have a home that's built in 2000, we're not going to need this form completed. However, if it is required on this home, we want to make sure that the name, all this is completed. A lot of times we won't have this parcel number, and that's okay, but we want to at least make sure the seller's name is there and the year built, as well as the address. And then this is one of those things where one or the other box needs to be completed within its row. Cannot be left blank.
Mm-hmm.
So if they skip, let's say they skip this section here, we need to send it back and have them refill it, recomplete it to show a box in one of the referring numbers. So, and then down here we have seller and buyer and sign.
Okay.
So moving on, this is the Alameda County disclosure, and I also included a Contra Costa disclosure. Depending on whatever county we're in, there's usually always an advisory. So these are the most common ones that are in Hines Realty Group. And you'll see here there is a mold. Why can I not find it right now? Here we go. Environmental hazards, and then there's also a wiring, which it might be. It's on the last page. I'll show you. It's not, I don't see it here for some reason. So the environmental, and we already had them initial in the statewide, but I always have them initial here too. It's just for double coverage and making sure it's okay. So I always have them initial right next to the environmental hazards because that covers mold and methane and all that stuff. Let me go down. Trying to find the last page. There we go. Wire fraud and electronic signatures. So I have them also initial here and initial here. You don't have to do this part, but I just throw it in there since I'm already there. And then again, the buyer and seller advisory. Another thing that we want to make sure is there is the address is typed out. Because if we ever lose a document and we find it, we're not going to know what property it goes to. So it's always a good idea and good practice to have that completed as well. Make sure it's there. So this is the Contra Costa advisory, and it's pretty much going over the same kind of details. You just want to make sure that that mold is initialed or acknowledged and that the electronic signature is completed.
Okay.
And I'm going to skip over this form because it's pretty much the same form as the other one. It's just different county. So it adds a couple more things, but not too many. If you see here, it's up here. Buyer and seller to sign. And that's pretty much it. There's other items, but I don't want to go too far into detail because there's so many different types of sales and, transaction
Yeah.
types. They're all different, but this is pretty much the standard bare bones disclosures that Hines Realty requires.
All right.
Yeah, that's it. Any questions?
I think so. So when offer is accepted, we'll get this full package of different disclosures, and we make sure it's complete, and then we put it into and we start a new file Sky Slope with it. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. One moment. Let me stop my recording.